A girl set out to sell cookies to her neighbors and vanished without a trace. Within hours, hundreds of local residents joined the search, and as time passed, even more people showed up. Together with the police, they combed every corner of the neighborhood, but they couldn't find her. Days went by, and it seemed like she had disappeared without a trace, until detectives uncovered the shocking truth. This revelation would not only shake the town to its core, but also set off a chain of events with consequences still felt to this day. Joan DeLandro was born on September 7, 1965, in the quiet town of Hillsdale, New Jersey. She had loving parents and two older brothers. Their family lived in a peaceful suburban neighborhood and was deeply religious. From an early age, Joan regularly attended her local church and later enrolled in a Baptist elementary school. Joan quickly made a lot of friends and did great in her classes. She also developed a love for ballet and really started to get into the art. At about the same time, Joan joined the Girl Scouts, spending a lot of time outdoors with other girls, picking up valuable life skills, socializing, and just having fun. One of their main activities was selling cookies. The girls would go door to door in their neighborhoods, asking people to buy them. April 19th, 1973 was Clean Thursday, and Joan's school had the day off. The 7-year-old spent it at home with her mom, mostly playing in the yard. Around 3 p.m., she saw one of her neighbors pull into the driveway. Some of the neighbors had pre-ordered cookies, and Joan would deliver the boxes once they were ready. By that afternoon, she only had a few deliveries left, so without wasting any time, Joan ran inside, grabbed a few boxes, and headed out. She told her mom she'd be back in a few minutes, but as time passed and Joan didn't return, her mom started to worry. At first, she assumed Joan might have bumped into some neighborhood kids and lost track of time playing with them. Their neighborhood was quiet and considered very safe, and back then, kids often played outside unsupervised. But when an hour passed and Joan still hadn't returned, her mom started to think something might be wrong. By then, it had started raining, and she thought Joan might have taken shelter at a friend's house to wait out the bad weather. The rain stopped pretty quickly, but Joan was still nowhere to be found. Soon after, her dad came home from work, and his wife told him she couldn't find Joan. He immediately got in his car and started driving around the neighborhood, looking for her, but there was no sign of Joan anywhere. Meanwhile, Joan's mom tried to find the list of addresses where her daughter was supposed to deliver cookies, but realized Joan had probably taken it with her. However, she remembered something Joan had said just before leaving. She hadn't mentioned which neighbor she was going to, but she had said that the person had just pulled into their driveway in a new car. Her mom immediately thought of a family who lived just a few houses down, as they were the only ones in the neighborhood with a new vehicle. While her husband continued searching the streets, she decided to check with those neighbors and visit some other houses where Joan might have dropped off cookies. Joan's mother visited several neighbors, but all of them said they hadn't seen the girl that day. Frustrated and increasingly alarmed, she returned home. When her husband told her he hadn't found any sign of their daughter either, they decided it was time to call the police. After hearing Joan's mother's story, officers jumped right into action and launched a large-scale search operation. The local fire department joined in, sending out crews to help, while the police went door to door in a several-mile radius, hoping someone might have seen Joan or could point them in the right direction, but no one had spotted the girl. This was quite odd, especially since the street leading away from Joan's house was a main road that led to a busy shopping center. Cars were constantly coming and going, yet no one had noticed a young girl walking in the area. As word of Joan's disappearance spread through the neighborhood, dozens of local residents began joining the search. Many of them knew Joan's family well and were eager to help in any way they could. The number of people involved in the search grew by the hour. By midnight, local officers requested assistance from the FBI and state police. Search dogs were brought in to track Joan's scent using her belongings, but the efforts led nowhere. Volunteers combed through abandoned lots, empty houses, nearby forests, parks, and even the shores of a local lake. But despite their dedication, there was no trace of Joan. At first, police considered the possibility that Joan might have wandered too far from home and gotten lost. But by the middle of the night, it became clear that the situation was far more serious. If she had simply lost her way, she likely would have been found by then. This led investigators to suspect foul play. Joan's mother dismissed any chance that her daughter had left somewhere voluntarily. Joan never wandered far from home without permission and always returned when she was supposed to. That day, she'd promised to be back in just a few minutes, so her mom was convinced something terrible had happened. Around 5 a.m., the police decided to take a break from the search and resume at sunrise. By morning, even more volunteers had joined in. It felt like the whole town had come together to look for Joan. Women who were home with their own children also found ways to help, preparing over 2,000 meals for the search teams throughout the day. Along with the local community, nearly every officer from the police department was involved, as well as about 250 firefighters from nearby towns and a few FBI teams. That day, searchers combed through every inch of the area. They entered every home, checked every yard, garage, shed, basically anywhere Joan could possibly be. But despite their exhaustive efforts, they found no trace of her. The search went on until one of the teams spotted a child's shoe less than a mile from Joan's home. It looked very much like the ones Joan had been wearing when she left the house. But that wasn't all. Near the shoe were several empty boxes of the same cookies Joan had been selling. Police immediately showed the shoe to Joan's mother, but the moment she saw it, she said it didn't belong to her daughter. On top of that, investigators examined the cookie boxes and concluded they had likely been there for several weeks. Eventually, some local residents came forward and identified the shoe. It belonged to their child. So, this lead was ruled out and investigators were back to square one. Despite their determination and the support of hundreds of volunteers, the day's search once again ended without answers. Meanwhile, the FBI began focusing heavily on the possibility of foul play. After speaking with Joan's mother, they learned that she had already visited all the neighbors where Joan might have delivered cookies. Each of them said that Joan had not come to their house, and there was no trace of the girl or the cookies anywhere, delivered and delivered. No, this thing came after my wife. However, Joan's mother shared something else with the detectives. A gut feeling she had about one particular neighbor. As we know, before leaving the house, Joan mentioned she was going to deliver cookies to a neighbor who had just pulled into their driveway in a brand new car. The only neighbors who had recently purchased a vehicle were the Mgas. So, Joan's mother went straight to their house. She was met by 26-year-old Joseph M. Gaw, who lived there with his mother and grandmother. He claimed he hadn't seen Joan, but something about him felt off. Joan's mom couldn't put her finger on it, she just had a bad feeling about him. The detectives had already spoken with Joseph, but he denied having anything to do with Joan's disappearance. Still, they couldn't ignore some red flags. He seemed to struggle with his own story, constantly tripping over details about his alibi for the time Joan went missing. But despite their suspicions, there wasn't any physical evidence in his home linking him to the case. Joseph also had no criminal record. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He worked as a school chemistry teacher and had a great reputation in the community. Still, as the hours turned into days, the detective's gut feeling about him only grew stronger. Eventually, they brought him into the station for a polygraph test, and Joseph agreed to answer their questions. The results weren't what he was hoping for. The operator flagged multiple signs of deception on nearly every key question. However, the police couldn't use the polygraph results as solid evidence of his guilt. Instead, they informed Joseph about his failure and kept pressing him to tell the truth. Eventually, to the surprise of the detectives, their persistence paid off, and in a quite unexpected way. Joseph broke down and asked them to bring a priest to the station. After speaking with the priest in private, Joseph finally confessed to what happened that day. According to his story, he had been mowing the lawn outside his house when Joan approached him with a few boxes of cookies. He said he had ordered them a couple of weeks earlier, so he invited Joan inside to pay for them. Yeah. From this point, Joseph's account took a strange turn. According to his words, he suddenly realized he didn't have the exact amount of cash to pay her, which, for some unknown reason, deeply upset him. Feeling ashamed, he grabbed Joan and dragged her to his bedroom, where he struck her multiple times and subjected her to other horrifying acts. The detectives, of course, didn't buy this part of his story for even a second, but they let him continue his confession. After committing these horrific acts, Joseph suddenly realized the gravity of what he'd done and started panicking about what to do next. He knew that if he let Joan go, it would destroy his life, so he decided to get rid of her. After several failed attempts, Joseph killed Joan, wrapped her body in an old sofa cover, and placed it in the trunk of his car. Then, he cleaned up the blood in his bedroom, stuffed the cleaning rags into a bag, and drove to a national park in neighboring New York State, about 20 miles from his home. At the park, he carried Joan's body into a wooded area and hid it behind a large rock. On his way back, he also disposed of the evidence in random trash bins along the road. Shortly after he returned home, Joan's mother came by looking for her daughter. Later, Joseph even joined the search efforts for the missing girl, along with hundreds of locals. After finishing his confession, Joseph said something quite unsettling. He told the police that despite everything he had done, he was completely calm that night and had no trouble falling asleep at all. While parts of Joseph's story immediately raised questions, investigators prioritized finding Joan's body. They contacted New York's Park Services, and Joseph gave them detailed directions to the location. Thanks to this, the search took less than an hour. Joan's body was discovered behind a large rock in a remote wooded area. Once medical examiners began their work, more inconsistencies in Joseph's story came to light. During his interrogation, Joseph insisted he didn't assault Joan, but forensic experts found undeniable evidence to the contrary. As for the rest, they did find numerous injuries and bruises, and his description of the cause of death aligned with reality. Joseph then told the Inquirer he had been accused of assault and beating, and they performed Joseph like 10,000 times, and it was all bad. And of course, I don't say this every week, but just to remind you, another glaring contradiction in Joseph's account was the fact that Joan's body was completely unclothed. Yet, even when detectives confronted him with this detail, Joseph continued to deny anything related to the assault. For Joseph's family and friends, the entire situation was a complete shock. They had always seen him as a decent, kind person and couldn't believe he was capable of something so horrific. His colleagues at the elementary school, where he worked as a chemistry teacher, were equally stunned. To them, Joseph was a talented and well-educated teacher who had never caused any trouble. As for the residents of their town, dozens of them began gathering outside Joseph's house in the days following his arrest. While most didn't act aggressively, police decided to block off the entire street as a precaution, fearing someone might try to harm his mother or grandmother. Some residents were so outraged by what had happened that they even started flipping through phone books looking for people with the last name Moine and calling them to unleash their anger. None of these individuals had any connection to Joseph, yet incidents like this became common. Several families even filed complaints, saying these calls were making their lives unbearable. Soon, the community was enraged, even more because the judge decided to set Joseph's bail at $50,000 after his arrest. While that was a huge amount of money for the time, people were furious. Hundreds of them flooded the court with angry letters, demanding the bail be revoked, insisting that Joseph should remain behind bars. And the thought of him potentially walking free and living just a few houses away from his victim's family was unthinkable. But not everyone opposed the idea of Joseph being released on bail. Some residents were actually eager for him to get out so they could take justice into their own hands. Under immense pressure, the court eventually changed its decision and revoked Joseph's bail, even though his family had already managed to gather the necessary amount. In the end, he was kept in jail to await trial and placed in solitary confinement for his own safety, as other inmates were eager to harm him. The trial began several months after Joseph's arrest, and he pleaded guilty to the murder. However, he continued to deny the fact of assault and insisted that the crime was a spontaneous act. According to him, he didn't understand what had come over him, but the prosecution wasn't buying it. Before the trial, several psychiatrists evaluated Joseph, and they all concluded that he had harbored dark, monstrous desires for many years. He had managed to hide these urges, presenting himself as a normal and well-adjusted person. But the moment he had the chance to act on his fantasies, he didn't hesitate for a second. There was also speculation suggesting that Joseph had planned something like this in advance. The fact that Joan's body was hidden deep in the woods behind a large rock raised serious doubts that he had chosen the spot on a whim. Investigators strongly believed he had known about the location long before the crime and kept it in his mind as a convenient place to dispose of a body. At the end of the trial, Joseph was sentenced to life in prison. But there was a catch. The laws at the time allowed for parole, even for someone like him, which meant the case was far from over. Nearly 20 years later, Joseph became eligible to apply for parole, causing outrage among Joan's family. Her parents said they hadn't even been informed that this was an option. To make matters worse, their attorney warned them that if they didn't take action to oppose his release, there was a strong chance Joseph would walk free. The problem was that over the years, Joseph had undergone multiple evaluations with psychiatrists, all of whom concluded that he was no longer a threat to society and could be released. Adding to his case was his spotless behavior throughout his time in prison. As a result, Joan's mother was forced to do everything in her power to convince the judge and others in the parole system that Joseph did not deserve to be released. At the same time, she decided to push for changes in the law to ensure that parole would never be an option for criminals like Joseph. After many years of relentless effort, she succeeded. A new law was passed in New Jersey that made anyone convicted of murdering a person under 14 for the purposes of SA ineligible for parole under any circumstances. Just a year later, a federal version of this law passed, mostly thanks to Joan's mother's tireless advocacy. As for Joseph, he didn't fall under the jurisdiction of the new laws. However, Joan's mother still managed to convince the court to deny his parole. But in 1999, another chance for his release came up, and this time, something unexpected happened. Before the decision was made, Joseph underwent another evaluation with a psychiatrist, whose job was to assess his mental state. During these conversations, Joseph suddenly changed the story he had been sticking to for over 20 years. Initially, he had claimed that he attacked Joan out of frustration when he couldn't find the right amount of change. That story had never been particularly convincing. According to Joseph, he had been going through personal struggles during that period of time. Known for interviewing infamous serial killers like Charles Manson, agreed to assess whether Joseph was fit to re-enter society. After their conversation, Douglas concluded that Joseph posed a significant danger to anyone around him, describing his uncontrollable urge to kill as deeply concerning. Douglas was so struck by this interview that he later wrote an entire book about it. Joseph's last attempt to secure parole was in 2008, with his next hearing scheduled for 2025. Joan's mother was preparing to oppose his release once again, but she didn't have to. Joseph passed away in 2021 at the age of 74. In the end, he spent most of his life behind bars and remained there until his death. As for Joan's mother, she continues her fight against criminals, like the one that took her daughter. A few years ago, she successfully pushed to raise the age limit in her original law from 14 to 18 in New Jersey. She also helped pass another law in the state that completely removed the statute of limitations for murder cases. In addition to that, she founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping children, which has achieved remarkable results over the years. Joan's mother plans to keep building on this work, both to honor her daughter's memory and to protect thousands of other children. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.